So both of you guys aren't loving the idea, it seems, of raising kids as kind of in a church as secular folk or as non-believers. There's another question that was somewhat similar. This is from Lisa and Alan. Lisa writes, when we lost our belief in God, my 9-year-old daughter wants to attend a non-denominational Christian church with her best friend. I am so torn. I don't want to influence her relationship with God. I want to teach her it's okay to learn about other faiths and to discover for herself what she wants to believe. I also don't want a preacher sucking her in. I don't want her indoctrinated at this tender age. How do you handle children who want to discover faith in God when, after Mormonism and all the harm it caused, leaves you feeling terrified to let them? And then one of our listeners, Emily, she wrote, mine are 6 and 2. Primary is too brainwashy, for the lack of a better word. The primary hymns are so black and white. Follow the prophet. I hope they call me on a mission. I love to see the temple. Are already unnecessary plugs for shame. What Margie is saying is what we have adopted, loving open discussions with respectful environments. My daughters are already thriving with this change. That's super helpful, Emily. But I don't want to leave this too quickly, because Natasha, if I can push back for a second, and Margie too, religion, some would argue that religion's what got us to the ball. In other words, religion's what got us here as a society to the advanced state that we're in now in 2019. And we should not be careless about jettisoning it. And I'll just add, Natasha, aren't there millions of people that raise their kids in a religious tradition and they don't really believe it? I'm thinking about Catholics that are cultural, Jews that are cultural, and lots of religions, and lots of Mormons, frankly. Lots of Mormon wards have people who don't really believe in the truth claims, but they just really value the spiritual sustenance, the moral structure, the community, the friendships. It seemed like neither of you guys wanted to even entertain that possibility, and I just want to understand. It seems like, Natasha, you're saying only in a mixed-faith marriage scenario. But
no, I guess I was pushing back against just participating in a structure because you feel like that structure has something to offer your kids, and you're not finding any value in it. Now, if you do find value in the community, if you find value in symbolic instead of literal meaning, to some of the Mormon teachings, if you find value in attending and listening to the music, and then by all means, then you're finding value in it, right? And that's what I mean by nuance. If you're a nuanced Mormon, or whatever those words we want to use, where people still want to stay engaged as adult people, and therefore you want to raise your children in that, you can do that in a way that kind of introduces critical thinking, different ways of being. This is how the Parker's Mormon, that's how the Smith's Mormon. And we do this anyway, right? I mean, I know people in my ward right now who do not take off their Sunday clothes on Sunday. Well, not all of us do that, right? We Mormon different ways. And so you can share with your kids that this is how we tend to do it. This is how Dad and I do it, whatever. So I guess the way that you had posited it to begin with is that I no longer believe, I no longer find value in the community myself.
Yes.
But yet I'm going to continue to engage only for the benefit of my children, who I think might benefit from some of the structure. Then I'm like, oh, that's pretty hard to stay involved in a community structure that you have not a lot of personal value for. But by all means, there are people that find a lot of value in kind of cultural, symbolic relationships with their religions of origin.
Yes. We interpreted it similarly, and I feel very much the same with you, Natasha. And yes, I hold these things very loosely, but if you were going to ask me, I do have something come up with where this feels a little empty container-ish to me. It's sort of like, well, now we don't have anything. So now I feel afraid because Richard Rohr is saying better to have something to rebel against than nothing. And I would just argue life experience, living is spirituality. There is plenty of meat there. No one is just nothing. No one has nothing. And that's where I feel like some of those fears come in, and the depravity, and and the truth is there are a lot of right ways, a lot of good ways to do things, and to approach parenting, and to approach spirituality and meaning and purpose.
And I'd like to hear your thoughts, John, on this, but even with the commenter who was like, well, I'm afraid to allow my daughter to be indoctrinated, or to go to a different church, or to be, or even the brainwashing that happens in primary. And maybe this is why I giggle to begin with, is that I think that sometimes as parents, we think we have a lot more control than we do. And we only tend to use the words indoctrination and things like that when it's other people's ideas that differ from ours. So if I am telling my children, hey, I believe in world peace and being loving, I don't see that as indoctrinating, right? I only see it as indoctrinating if somebody's giving an idea that I disagree with,
yeah,
that I don't like.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, I'm not going to minimize that there are obviously structures, and different kids might relate to authority differently. And it is hard when we feel like either a mentor or a school teacher or a church person tends to have more authority, or that our kids are respecting them more than they respect us. And I think that happens to all parents in all different kinds of scenarios, not just religious scenarios. Because remember, again, part of the developmental process, especially in teenage land, is to kind of kick against what you know, and what better do you know than your own parents. So, but I guess I would just encourage people to be more comfortable with ambiguity, flexibility, that you can trust, that you can share your thoughts with a daughter, for example, that's going with her friend to church, and that, she will hopefully have a good experience and be able to come back. And the more anxious you are, or the more worried she realizes that it's not safe to talk about that, which goes into this enmeshment category, then actually you're kind of creating more of what you hope won't be there. You're creating a higher risk that they'll lean in that direction, because you're not safe to talk about those kinds of things, or to have different experiences than what you're comfortable providing. So that's a real balancing act as parents that we all struggle with. At what point do I let my child do something that I'm not super gung-ho about? Mm-hmm. At what point do I allow for flexibility on that kind of stuff and trust the process? That's really hard, and there's different ages where that becomes, something people might think about differently.
Yeah. How would you approach that, honey?
Which part?
The question that we talked about the child that wanted to try out a non-denominational Christian church, and she was feeling like a fear that she would be indoctrinated.
This is me just being vulnerable. I think I am astounded by how amazing our children are. So of course, probably lots of parents think their kids are amazing, but I look at our kids and I think they're amazing. Having said that, I'm trying to be self-critical, realizing that, there probably have been downsides or disadvantages to things that we've chosen. There probably have been positive and negative implications for what we've chosen. And I think partly I am really influenced by how idyllic I remember my Mormon upbringing being. So just all the dances, all the youth conferences, all the temple trips and dance festivals, and carrying youth leaders, and the moral structure, and then just kind of how I fared with all that, going to college and doing well, and then going on to a successful career. Of course, there were problems, but I have a hard time letting go of the fact that I feel like I'm very happy with how I perceive Mormonism's influence being on my life. And then I think about how hard sometimes it was on our kids once we left, especially in Utah, how they lost friends, how they lost community, how we did our best to supplement with spirituality and morality and open, candid conversations in the home. But sometimes I felt like our kids and our family were isolated. Sometimes I felt like they struggled to find friends. Sometimes I felt like I wondered, could we have taught them more about spirituality? And most importantly, could our kids have benefited from a tighter knit community of support, of other adults that could mentor them, of other friends that would come just naturally by being part of the community? And I think it's a mixed bag. And again, it's easy for me to just want to wave the flag of post-Mormonism or liberal Mormonism and say everybody follow, but I want to be responsible about that and not just recklessly say that, leaving is the best for everyone. And I know no one here is saying that as well. I'm going to bring in a couple comments. Aaron writes, let's see, there are a couple good comments here. Aaron writes, let's see, sorry. It took a while to accept and embrace the idea that my kids can turn out just fine without religion. Then she writes, so many options out there now to meet the needs for community outside of organized religion. And I hear that too, bike clubs or, what are some of the, I'm curious to know what community options there are. I know that soccer can be a little community of sorts. Ultimate Frisbee is a big thing here. I'm curious to hear options that people find for community. I know that there's Oasis here in Salt Lake City, which is a secular community. I know that oftentimes these groups like Waka or Coca here along the Wasatch Front, or even some of these post-Mormon communities can be community. But I think we should do a whole episode on finding community outside of Mormonism. Sam writes, John, a huge segment of the population in Europe has been living happily secular lives since the end of World War II. We can figure this out by looking at healthy secular cultures. And I would like to learn more about that.
This is why I love reading about places like Denmark
the
or
Hygge, right?
Is because it is something that is absolutely integrated into their culture and how the country is run, how they look at things. I'm fascinated as well.
So tell our listeners what the Hygge concept is really quick, and then I want to push back a little bit.
Well, the Hygge concept isn't connected necessarily to this
to
part
community.
Of it. Hygge is a feeling of safety, an idea. It's part of how I would say they approach everyday living. It's a value, Hygge. But they what they do secularly in Denmark that I find is really, really inspiring is in lieu of like religious institutions that are large and bulky and oftentimes can be less personal, is they tend to naturally couples, the average is like 3 to 4 couples naturally get together and they show up for each other and have dinner parties or games and within those gatherings, the element of Hygge is something that is valued. And Hygge just means it's safe, it's personal. You don't really go into like politics if it's going to be divisive. It's just this it's very thoughtful and warm and comforting and connecting. And these are the communities that when someone gets sick or if things are happening, it's personal enough that they all know it. But the difference is they actually have this deeply connected relationship that rises up to meet the needs that way. And so that's a little bit of what I've read with regard to Denmark and the idea of community there. It's a smaller community, think 8 to 10 to 12 people, and kind of like what we're trying to create with our book club, honestly.
Yeah. And I'll just say that there's a part of me that just wonders how successful that might be. Like we share a book about Hygge with 3 other families, and then we say, hey, post-Mormon friends in Salt Lake City, let's Hygge together like the Danes. And how long?
I'm down on it. I'm there.
I'm a little bit skeptical, and that's my skeptical self. I'm a little bit skeptical about whether that'll actually work out and how scalable it is as well. So this is just me being reflective. Kristen writes, I was really scared post-Faith Crisis that my children didn't have a church community or youth group. I searched diligently to replace the church with another church. Over time, though, through our church shopping experience, I realized we were fine without religion.
We did a little bit of that too.
Yeah, And that's how we were, Kristen. So I'm not even saying, I guess I'm arguing against myself a little bit, but I'm also trying to be open, because a lot of listeners are asking this question. Sam continues and he writes, John, one of the most fascinating things to consider about the relationship between secular and religious culture is that there's almost no focus on environmental sustainability in religious cultures. I studied sustainability for my doctoral research and learned that you almost have to be secular to be able to let go of the concept of heaven in order to be able to let go of in order to focus on living on a sustainable earth.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, and there's no question that many religious values can be deeply problematic, and that many religious values neglect completely many important secular values. So that's all true. I hope I haven't taken us down a rat hole, but this is just something that.
Well, I think what you're saying is that there is something to many of us, and I think that many of us, even listening today, could look back on our Mormon upbringing and find very dear memories about those kinds of community things, which is a lot of what you speak about, John. I think we also want to make sure we include the stories where it wasn't so ideal, right? So if you're raising a gay child, that's not going to be the same experience as what you had growing up, right, John? Or even gender different, sometimes women have different ideas about growing up Mormon versus boys, or boys who don't necessarily fit the kind of gender model of leadership and, things like that they don't necessarily find a lot of enjoyment in. So some of this is individual. I mean, some people really did thrive in the many ways that the Mormon structure offered them. And many people actually were harmed by that too. So there's even if you're both believing Mormons, if you're in a mixed faith marriage, if you're post-Mormon, if you're nuanced Mormon, that's still a reality that your kids may or may not have a positive experience in any structured environment that you offer them. The potential for bullying, the potential for groupthink, the potential for influence, indoctrination, if you want to call it that. And so at some level, I think it's good to be aware of that and to try to assess risk and benefit given your family situations. I also think that it's important to have some level of acceptance that no matter what you offer, there's going to be problems. There's going to be, like you said, John, strengths and maybe challenges to whatever decisions you made, as parents. And if we get caught in that what if trap, and or if you blame, again, and this is why I giggle at us, why I tease ourselves, is that we tend to be very black and white thinkers. We tend to want equational approaches, so that when and if your child struggles, let's say in college, it's very easy to go back and go, oh my gosh, that's because we didn't provide a structured environment and we left Mormonism, right? Or, oh my gosh, it's because we didn't leave Mormonism and we stayed involved, right? And so I'm just saying, life is much more complex than any one explanation. Your kids will struggle and thrive. And as long as you've got somewhat of a pulse on really extreme aspects of that and avoiding extreme bullying behaviors, or, taking your kids out of places where they're not going to thrive, I think, in general, it's not as big of a deal as we're probably making it out to be.
Yes. And I think it's so interesting how quickly it can feel very like a desperate affair, that the stakes are all of a sudden very, very high. And that's fear. There's a lot of fear in that. And one thing that I just would invite to the conversation is also this idea of how our stories inform how we parent. And that's a bias of sorts, like any other bias. And you were kind of getting to this, Natasha. And the extent to which we can see our children as separate entities with a separate, needs and I don't know. I think that is helpful because we do bring our own bias. And the truth is our children in the church never had the experience John had. And they're wired differently, and they weren't seeking the same things, and they weren't in the same place in their life needing the same things. And so it can kind of get in our way. oftentimes in parenting. What works better is to go to the child, to ask questions of the child, to allow even your child to lead, to not put your story, your fear, your experiences, your wounds onto your child for them to carry. They don't have your story, they will have their own.
And we need to be aware of the story that's told within Mormonism. I'm sure a lot of people here have had some type of an experience where it's like, well, my in-laws or my parents are, as they're watching us leave, are saying things like, you're going to ruin the children. What about the children? And the story within Mormonism is very much about, you're responsible for teaching the gospel to the children. And if you don't do that, you have failed. And now that responsibility lies on you. So some of this angst comes from the self-fulfilling kind of prophecies or the narrative that Mormonism offers us. So I want to help us all take a Valium, but also like at the same time recognize that I know why this is a very tender subject. This causes a lot of anxiety for good reasons, because we love our kids. We want what's best for them. And when we're shifting in a way that affects us, now we realize it's also going to affect all these other people that are part of our system. And what does that mean? Yeah.
One mantra that has really helped me, which I hold mantras loosely as well, but is this idea of an abundance model as opposed to a scarcity model where we have to fight for everything. It's always desperate. We never have what we need. Our kids are never, to abundance. It's like we have all we need. Our children are naturally full. And this idea that life is wise, that there are many, many paths and there's wisdom in it all. And, it's much more the meaning we create than trying to create this path that has just the right meaning.
Emily writes, I could use Valium. Thanks for
I love my Valium comments. I was like, let's take a chill pill or a Valium.
That's right.
That's my mantra.
All the way around.
Thanks for sharing, Emily.
Breathe.
Just to close this little discussion / black hole that I took us down, I'm just going to say that I still wonder, as skeptical as people are, as much as I agree with you guys that we're whole, as much as I agree with the principles we're all talking about, I wonder if there would be a way, again, all the holes that develop when you leave a church: spirituality, identity, community, friends, existential concerns, health code. Just think of all the things that a religion provides that you have to renegotiate and potentially lose. What if there could be like a secular handbook that sort of tells you best practices on spirituality, secular Buddhism or Eckhart Tolle or whatever? It tells you best practices on parenting. It tells you best practices on finding secular community. It tells you how to deal with the God question and plugs those existential holes. It helps you find friends. It helps you learn the best practices of healthy marriages. It gives you a sense of meaning and purpose and helps you find best practices for meaning and purpose. It gives you a list of books to read and movies to watch and resources for living life after, in a secular age. I just wonder if that package were available as an option for a newlywed couple or for a young couple that wants to get married, or for new parents, or for people who leave a religion, where they could just sort of like, instead of having to do all that work to piece it together, community approved resources that have been aggregated can be made available. I just wonder whether that would accelerate and simplify the process for many. And I'll end with this comment that Jimmy makes. Jimmy writes, and I think this is astute, and it's a concern I've had as well. Jimmy writes, off of John's recent comment on wanting to be responsible with progressive Mormon community in the following, I just started wondering if the ability to transition or spiritually evolve to progressive theologies or spiritual frameworks is related to class, or I would say privilege, not just how much money we have. I wonder if class, meaning socioeconomic status or social status, has more to do with this ability to think deeply and choose which moral framework we have and pass on to our children. My own critique of the progressive Mormon community I am a part of and the support I provide to struggling Mormons comes from the consideration of other Mormons who are in a space where they can't choose. A low socioeconomic status single Mormon mom I know in my community with an abusive ex-husband comes to mind. I am wondering how this consideration changes or likely builds the nuance of this important conversation. In a way that I would branch off of that is just to say, sure, Natasha, maybe you can piece together a wonderful post-Mormon life. Sure, Margi, you can. What about families that aren't in the same intellectual, socioeconomic, or financial situation of privilege to be able to piece something together? What about them? Could they use support? Because maybe they don't have time to listen to 50 hours of podcasts or read a bunch of books or go and find which books to read to then read them or search out all these different communities. Is that an important component? And I guess I'm going to leave that theoretical because I think you guys already feel like you've answered. Is that true?
Yeah, and it's something that I think we've discussed in the past, not necessarily on this parenting one, but in faith transitions in general, to not assume, and I think we've encouraged people to not assume that the post-Mormon route is the best route for everybody, or that, that again, what's working for us would automatically work for other people. That there are plenty of people, both within Mormonism, within other religious structures, and of course outside of religious structure, who are struggling to survive, that have very complex issues. And the reality that I hear from many Mormon individuals, in particular, in situations just like Jimmy is describing here, is that the Mormon Church is a lifesaver because it is structure, it is community, it is casserole bringing or financial kind of a safety net, for some of these people. And so we want to be very careful as faith transitioners to not assume that, everybody in Mormonism is brainwashed and it hurts everybody. And again, these very black and white ways that I think sometimes those of us who are transitioning or post-transitioning can make sweeping statements about an entire group of people. So we want to be very careful that just like we don't want to be generalized, that we're not generalizing people who stay within. And that I don't think we do a very good job of providing that outside of religious communities. Not always, but in general. Mm-hmm. In general, that was a huge push in the Bush administration that I remember the government themselves saying, maybe we need to, think about what faith communities are doing for the welfare of this nation. And can we support that, those efforts instead of just having a government welfare system? Now, again, there are secular countries that I think do a much better job of welfare in general for their citizens and that aren't necessarily religiously focused at all, such as Denmark or some of these European countries. So none of these statements are black and white. I'm just saying they're all important things to be considering.
And I would say just as like Denmark developed Hygge in a secular wave post-World War II, now is America's secular wave, it seems. And if that's true, I don't think whatever secular cultures emerge happen on their own. I think it involves conscientious, privileged, if possible, if that makes sense, if that word makes sense, secular people to form whatever cultures and communities will work here. No? Because I don't think it just happens by chance. Okay, Natasha, you have a point about being a spiritual or existential leader in the home. A lot of people ask questions about that, about how do I provide family members spirituality outside of religion? Do you want to talk about that a bit? And then Margi, I think you might have a few things to say about spirituality after a faith crisis with children.
Yeah, and I'm going to start off with a comment we got from Emily Holyoke, who she says, let's see, I teach my daughters things that are facts. We own many, many earth science, physics, and critical thinking books for their appropriate age. My husband and I teach on the morals of being human and leaving the earth and society better than how you found it. I know zero spirituality isn't for everyone, but it works for us. So some of this is how we define even the word spirituality. For me, I would, when she's saying that she is teaching about morals and leaving the earth in a better space, to me, that's in the umbrella of spirituality, because I see spirituality is kind of embodying those things that are kind of outside of our physical being and outside of our kind of ego realm, right? So benefits of the community at large, the universe, things of that nature. Some people really don't like the word spiritual, so that's why I use existential or whatever word you want to use in there. But I think oftentimes the idea is that we black and white, we allow for religion and spirituality to only mean certain things, and facts and science only mean certain things. And I think we need to really be both, be a teacher of all these different things to our children, and to not allow religion to co-opt words like morality, spirituality, ethereal, all these words that can speak to those moments of enlightenment or things that tons of people describe, whether they're religious or not, right? So connection to something bigger than yourself, whatever those words mean. And emotion is part of that, and instinct, and kind of, gut sense for things. Those are important things to be honing into your kids. And sometimes I think post-transition, we're very historical and scientifically driven, and we forget that there's a lot of, I'm going to use the word spiritual components to life, relational components to life, emotional components to life that you can't necessarily measure, that, we do our best in the social sciences to come up with things that are scientifically, in a scientific model, but even then it's largely an art. And so that you're making sure that you're offering those things to your kids, not just facts. And
what do you mean? Give us some examples of being a spiritual leader in the home, Natasha.
Well, I think and I'll also bring in another thing that I think is part of this is, for example, family home evening is not owned by religion, right? And so what can we think about, like, for example, the ritual of family home evening from a perspective of it's a time to gather around, share some ideas, maybe share some good teachings, a TED Talk, for example, or even things like scriptures. Scriptures are not owned by religion. And by what I mean by scriptures, like really well thought out, interesting literature that leads to personal ideas. I mean, you can take some of Brene Brown's work, for example, and I would say that's pretty close to scripture, but it's not measured. It's not science. It's more just like, here's a thought that helps us get out of our own, our own physical standpoints. It's something bigger than just historical scientific facts. And we as humans definitely have that type of outlook, that we need something that feeds our quote unquote souls, if you will, spirits, if you will. These are the language that we use, but that language has been co-opted by religion. I'm just saying it doesn't have to be. We can reclaim those words in ways that we are now teaching our children things like, what is it like to feel, to be in a state of meditation? What is it like to feel your body respond to what you consider to be a truth for yourself? What is it like to experience an emotion, and how you then use that emotion to have relational, experiences in your life? What is it like to glean knowledge? Even scientific knowledge can have a physiological reaction. You can get goosebumps on your arms, in the laboratory when you find a new cure to something, right? I mean, that's a very spiritual moment. But are we using that kind of language instead of being very, matter of fact, kind of robotic about the ways that we present information to our children? So I would just invite people to not let religion take that from us.
Okay, I like that concept. I like your idea of family home evening. Margi, what are some ways that we've tried to encourage a sense of spirituality in our home?
So kind of thinking back so I can kind of have a full perspective, one thing that I view as valuable is this idea of introducing ideas into your home. And the way that I oftentimes, so for like when the children were middle childhood, so before they became teens, it was as easy as reading books together. I remember a couple books, Old Turtle and the Broken Truth. But I would actually look for books to begin conversations, to start exploring with the kids what they thought about the book or what they liked about the book, and it really is about just exposing children to ideas. I remember we watched the documentary on Food Inc., and that had it had ecological ideas, treatment of animals, or it had a health component. It had, or Girl Rising at one point. So documentaries, think about Mr. Rogers. What's the Mr. Rogers documentary? Talking about activism, the face of activism, what it can look like. What do you care about? What is something that's important to you? It's this idea of creating exposure to ideas with emotion, with a story, where, hopefully they get perspectives that are different from their own, and they slowly go internal and learn kind of what their thoughts are. And you create discussions that are safe and that are productive and exploratory. So those are a couple. Remember the Material World book, when the kids were kind of 8 to 10, 6 to 10, I had these books by Peter Menzel, where one was called Material World, one was called Women in the Material World. And what they did was they went around the world and they had people bring all of their valuables, all their belongings outside their homes. And you could see the difference in homes, the difference in belongings, what people had. And then they oftentimes would ask, what's your most valuable possession? And reading through Molly, like going to different places, allowed, I feel like, a perspective that they might not otherwise have. And so that's one way I think you can go about, spirituality, is creating conversations, creating sort of these opportunities to connect to ideas that they might otherwise not have. And that is something that I took seriously for many, many years, was just gathering some things that I thought would be thought-provoking.
I think about some of the things I remember us doing. We were really nervous for a while that Sundays didn't feel as holy as other days. And it's just so easy to, like you said, Natasha, to limit what we perceive the term spirituality to mean, to be hymn singing or talks, sermons given over a pulpit, or choirs, or testimonies, right? And
or even to deal with God or deity. It doesn't have to be that either.
Yeah.
Or you have to be sitting in a chair listening.
And so and so we would do Super Soul Sunday, where each Sunday we would pull the kids together and watch a 30-minute interview of Oprah interviewing Brene Brown, or Oprah interviewing Eckhart Tolle, or Oprah interviewing who's the one things fall apart person,
Pema
Chodron, right? It had to be mystical, or it had to be new agey. I remember trying to introduce Eckhart Tolle to our kids and just how put off they were, and just zero interested in learning about Eckhart Tolle.
But that was okay. Then we were like,
okay. And then we would always do a hike, and we would say, and people like this, they call it hike church or nature church, right? And we would. What's so funny? You're laughing.
Just that Winston recently was just like, it was like they're coming into themselves, both Winston and Clara, where they were just like, I want you to know I never liked hiking. I don't like it. I don't want to do that on myself. It's like anti-Sabbath to me to go on a hike. It's just funny.
And we're just like, oh, but it's nature.
Like,
and
let's connect. It's beautiful.
The wind,
don't we feel
and
free? We can do anything.
There's the rushing water and the sounds.
See, and this comes full circle. You offered something they could rebel against.
Right. That's right.
They're rebelling against
The
nature.
difference is we welcomed it. We were like, okay, noted, all right.
It's less fun practically than it is philosophically. It sounds good philosophically,
Right.
unless the rebellion comes against us, and then all of a sudden it feels a lot less good.
Right.
But what I hear you guys, and the family evening idea is also something we tried to do, and sometimes honestly, when you don't have guilt and fear and shame and a prophet and concerns about the afterlife and this culture of expectation where you have to report back, am I doing sort of the PPI culture where it's like, yes, I'm having my family home evening, yes, I'm having worthiness interviews with my children, yes, sometimes without that accountability, I do think non-religious people can have to confront their own motivations and maybe their own laziness or just comfort of not really acting. And anyway, it's definitely, I love what you guys are saying about being more creative about what spirituality means. I think art and creativity can be spiritual. I think that just connecting with good friends can be spiritual. Just having friends over for a barbecue.
We did that too.
Yeah,
Socrates Cafe.
Yeah. Over the time, we've occasionally had friends over and just had barbecues and just lovely conversations that ensue. Why isn't that spirituality? Why does it have to be in a church with music and a sermon to count as spirituality?
And that's part of that process that you go through with transition, is you actually renegotiate what spirituality or whatever term you want to, kind of give it to connecting with yourself or connecting with something larger, what that's going to look like and feel like for you.
Natasha, another bullet that you mentioned is keeping the rituals that work. We talked about family home evening as one ritual that works from our heritage. I'm curious if either of you have ideas of rituals that you've kept from Mormonism that work.
Well, so much of what we know as far as, healthy coping mechanisms in the mental health field, for example, kind of mirror spiritual practice. So even the whole concept of mindfulness, it's so pop culture these days, right, is similar to prayer practice or contemplative practice. We know that journaling can really be helpful from a mental health standpoint. Well, guess what tradition we were encouraged to do, as Mormons, or gratitude. We know that having gratitude and kind of thinking through things that you're thankful for can be really helpful for mental health, right? And Mormonism kind of presented some of these opportunities. Now, granted, the problem with how Mormonism presented those opportunities is that it was often co-opted by shame and guilt if you didn't do them. Like somehow it was tied to deity being pleased with you or not. So it had a shame component to it, which is not healthy. But a lot of these things that we can kind of take with us, and there is something, again, through mental health research showing that ritual, so it's something more than just, oh yeah, I'd like to kind of do this, but to really create a ritual, whether it's lighting a candle or creating a background or having a certain space or time or timing something or creating certain symbols, can be very helpful in us integrating things that we want to for our own health and well-being. So there's a lot of opportunity to, take, I always talk about Carolyn Pearson's poetry, about as you're going through the wilderness as a pioneer, oftentimes you had to reload the cart and you could only take what was really super precious to you. So we don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We can take some of these things that became, and for some of us that are transitioning, I hear this a lot, like I miss scripture reading or I miss praying as a family. Well, why can't you create a ritual where you have a gratitude circle, right? And you hold hands, and instead of folding your arms and, having the classic Mormon prayer, you do a different type of prayer per se. Or you have a journal time, or you create scriptures that are different than the standard works, right? So whether those are wonderful philosophers or ideas or Rumi or whomever, that you create, you decide what your scripture is going to look like, and you share that as a family, or you do a yoga or a breathing exercise instead of a, traditional startup to a family home evening, for example. So reclaiming these things that never belonged to Mormonism anyway. Mormonism had a certain structure or a certain idea of how to do those things, keeping what really benefits us, teaching our kids those things, creating family ritual around some of these traditions that can be very useful. Even when kids complain about them, like even the nature walks, even when they complain against them, they can still be useful. They can still be things that they look fondly back on, as far as some of those things that parents prioritize.
One ritual that I think of is the Sunday being kind of a special day set apart from the others. I think in some ways we still do that. We try and limit our screen time on Sundays. We try and limit, the things that isolate, and especially social media on Sunday. And we try and do a family movie, or we try and
have dinner.
Together. We try and, if we can, go on a hike, if anyone will go. Sometimes Winston and I will snowboard, or Winston, Claire, and I will snowboard on a Sunday. But we try and not just make it another work day. Were you going to say anything about rituals that you've kept or that you like the idea of keeping?
I was just going to say how much I loved Natasha's idea around, substituting in. And just a couple substitutions we've done is, I love the idea of pausing before a dinner meal. I like the idea of just taking a moment before we just dive into food and dive into conversation, to just have a moment of presence. And so one thing we did was we created a gratitude moment where we do go around the table and the kids share one thing they're grateful for. The scripture reading, so we clearly don't scripture read anymore, but for many, many years, I instead would read with my kids before they went to bed. So where that might have, once been a scripture time or a prayer time, it was we're going to read Charlotte's Web, or we read The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane, books that evoke a lot of meaning, books that, I think also create emotional experience, journeying, and conversations where I was able to have really lovely conversations, I think, out of that. So those are a couple substitutions. Meditation for me every morning is definitely my way of trying to kind of create a bit of presence, a little bit of awareness with my own thoughts. And so anyway, having our Sundays feel a little bit different than other days. And, our teens, we have teens now, allowing our teens to have a say in what that means for them is really important. And, whereas Winston was, vocal about saying, I don't like to hike. That's not something I like to do, but I do really like to skateboard. And so we realized for him that we will oftentimes drive him for an hour or two to go to a skate park so that he gets that time of, it centers him. It's a very flow experience for him. And that's something he wanted as part of his Sunday. So it's also integrating, particularly when your children, get older, but even when they're younger, if your family wants to kind of also have your children play a part in deciding what they would like for Sundays to feel like, or what some components they would love as part of the mix, that can be a fun part of the process.
Natasha, another point you had listed as something you like to talk about is the importance of teaching critical thinking skills and the differentiation skills that are required. I often think about maybe the biggest transition made from the first half of life to the second is moving from an extrinsic source of authority, which as parents we kind of naturally are to at least some degree, moving to an intrinsic source of authority. And of course, as progressive post-Mormons, we think of that as sort of moving from the church being our authority, or for the brethren or the church leaders being our authority, to being our own moral authority. And so I imagine there's a trick between being a parent, but also nurturing in your kids their own sense of intrinsic moral authority, their own critical thinking skills. What do you like to say about that?
Yeah, I do think that in our Mormon upbringings, we really weren't offered this. We were offered more of this is how it is, and we sure hope that you come to this conclusion.
Because it's right.
Because it's right, and
True,
this is how, yeah,
true.
right, and this is how you do that. You know, you pray and you fast and you read scriptures, and if you don't come to this conclusion, then there's really no room for the system to be wrong. You're doing something wrong, you know, in that process. So that's kind of a problematic way to come to any conclusion that's already foretold for you. So even while we were still very much attending church, or anytime we go anywhere that might have some level of authority, like a different church, or even a different experience, like funerals or things of that nature, I really started this tradition of just asking, tell me something that you really liked about this experience, or that you had an aha moment, or that you felt the spirit, or whatever language you want to use. And then tell me something that you didn't find very pleasing, or that you were confused by, or that you actually didn't like, or that you disagreed with. So it gave us all an opportunity, just by those two questions, to first of all give permission for difference of thought, just by doing that. So that I could say, well, I really like Sister So-and-so's talk, you know, where she's talking about the volunteer work she did, you know, at the soup kitchen, and thought that was awesome. And I really didn't like, you know, Brother So-and-so's talk that focused so much on Satan. It felt very fear-based and shamey, and, you know, I just didn't get a good feeling when he was talking about those kinds of things. Well, now all of a sudden they're getting the clue that it's not just, oh, we're telling you what to think or believe. I actually get to have a say in what I think or believe, or, you know, how I interpreted those kinds of situations. And I was surprised sometimes that when my kids came up with things I wouldn't have considered, or things that, you know, I saw it sometimes as an opportunity for me to offer nuance, but I was also surprised that when my kids came up with that I wouldn't have considered problematic, or that I would have not thought of as something that would have been helpful. So that was a good clue into my kids. But so, do we have enough and differentiation skills go along with this? Because then again, can we tolerate what our kids come up with? You know, like, well, we hated going on the nature walk. We thought it was lame. When you're like, no, this is really healthy, and this is really wonderful, and being on a walk is good for you. You know, how can you tolerate that they might have a different experience of that? But it also teaches them to be thinking about, do I have the permission to have my own thoughts? What is this like for me? I have a say. And then as they get older, I kind of talk about critical thinking skills even a little bit differently, especially around, I think a really good time to do this is around advertisings. So it's kind of like, who's behind this? Who's paying for it? What's the agenda? You know, what are they trying to sell you, if anything? Whether it's, you know, research or advertisements or messages or political parties, it's like, what information, what emotion are they trying to get us to feel? You know, so those are kind of interesting. Not that we do that every single time there's an ad, but every now and then I try to have those kinds of conversations so that they can, again, be thinking that just because I'm feeling something, or just because I'm brought into the moment, doesn't necessarily mean that this is quote unquote true. Or, and, you know, my husband and I have had plenty of opportunity to show them differentiation skills on this, because, you know, we don't always agree on political or environmental or things of that nature. And so, you know, when we see something that I'm like, oh yeah, pay attention to that, my husband's like, well, who's running this ad? You know, and I'm like, don't ask that question when it's an ad I like. Right?
And the message is so clearly true.
It's so clearly true. So my kids have had definitely plenty of opportunity to see the back and forth volleying of people with different ideas.
That's great stuff. Great stuff. I was going to say, what you just mentioned reminded me of a couple documentaries that as a family, they were really, really important to us. And that is Misrepresentation. So that is, it takes on, you know, women in culture, how women are portrayed. And the second is The Mask You Live In, which is men. So men and emotions.
About toxic masculinity in U.S. culture.
And both of those, watching them with our teen children, was just very, very valuable. And I would say probably, what would you say, 14 and above, 15 and above maybe. So kind of old, mid-teenage kind of years. But those were two documentaries that, as you're talking about advertising, sorry, that was in both documentaries. So
yeah, cool.
Yeah, those are valuable. I do think watching documentaries is a great way to develop critical thinking skills. Watching news with your kids, just using car rides to talk about things, listening to podcasts together has been a phenomenal way. Some of our older kids have really gotten into podcasts, and even younger kids or YouTube channels. There are a lot of good podcasts and YouTube channels out there that introduce really important topics that can get your kids thinking about different topics and can become really good fodder for developing critical thinking skills. And I think that's really important. So I'm glad you talk about that, Natasha. And I do think that's one of the greatest opportunities when we talk about a gift of a faith crisis is helping our kids become more skeptical. Here's what's hard though. What happens when, one of the things I love about patriarchy is how efficient it is. What happens when your kids, get this self-empowerment of critical thought and they don't want to obey and do everything you tell them, and they want to question everything you want? That makes parenting more difficult.
If you're more time. If you're control mindset, that's true.
I'm just saying, do it because I said so is a lot more efficient. I'm being silly. Then let's talk about why you need to do this, because we're helping you develop critical thinking skills.
I really love the process. It is harrowing, and it is not all, I would not say it's without stress, but I have really, really appreciated the process of seeing my children evolve and voice themselves and get to know themselves and be courageous and speak out even when it's against me. Winston will say, "You are speaking to me in a rude way, and I am leaving until you can pull it together." I love that. I'm like, look at you. And then I'm like, stop. Oh, look at that emotional. You are so connected, son. Hey, son. So
go to your room. You're being disrespectful, but I really appreciate being called out.
I'm like, good call, true. I'm going to calm down. Yeah, I'll be back in a minute.
Be aware that this causes you as a parent to have to slow down and
connect with yourself.
And connect with yourself and connect with your kids. I agree with you, Margie. It has huge payoffs in the end, because you want your kid guided by an internal moral compass that's well reasoned and that's intrinsic to them. But that means you have to give them the freedom and the space to figure that out. And sometimes it's not going to be what you want. And sometimes your kids are going to go, "I don't care if you want me to spend time with grandma. I don't want to spend time with grandma." And they don't want to,
I was thinking of some more dire situations than that, but that is true.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I want to smoke weed.
I'm just saying, there's a lot out there.
Sometimes I want to have sex.
Yeah.
And this is where I think too, again, looking at the circumplex model is helpful, because in our family, and I'm not saying that this has to be the case, but in our family, I would be comfortable saying, "I appreciate your thoughts about not wanting to spend time with grandma, and yet this is kind of what we're doing today, whether you want to do that or not." So I can tend to be a little bit more structural in my approach at times, not all the time, but at times, because, and I'll give reasoning and things like that. And we also, I remember, had a Incredibles moment, the Incredibles family, where in the first movie, the mom is flying the airplane and she's having to do a crash landing, and she's telling Violet, do this thing. And Violet's like having a philosophical conversation with herself, about whether or not she should do this thing that needed to be done in the moment because it was an emergency. And we had a situation like that where one of our kids had an allergic reaction at a basketball game. And we very quickly, we were dealing with hives and passing out. And we had, so we were just trying to gather everybody and come on, we've got to go now. And we had kind of a similar reaction like Violet, but you said that we could do that. And you know, you don't have time for your philosophical arguments about your needs right now.
Yes.
So that gave us an opportunity to say that at times, not a lot of the time, but when mom and dad are in kind of a mode of anxiety and panic, you have to just kind of obey in those moments because there's an emergency, you know, there's an emergency situation. So again, this is not black or white. This is not all or nothing. It's not that kids always get their way or that parents always get their way, or that it's more about, and I think what you're saying with the slowing down process is that if you're going to take some of these strategies to heart, it does take more time to be an intentional parent than to be a dictatorial parent. It does take more conversation to talk about reasons versus just do it because I said so, you know. So in general, I lean in that direction. And at the same time, I'm just making room that there are things that some parents may do differently than others. And it doesn't mean that you're outside of that primary circle of correct ways of having a system.
Margi, you in your reading with Shefali Saybury, you know, a lot of we're talking about the parents' way or the kids' way. We're talking about, you know, critical thought. You know, one of the things that really is a powerful part of conscious parenting that is also really tricky is how do you do discipline and rules with kids now that you don't have the words of a prophet and commandments and scripture necessarily, and the church imposing what some have perceived to be guilt and shame and fear to get your kids to follow rules and obey. How do you enforce enlightened boundaries and or rules, and what's the role of punishment in parenting without kind of a religious structure?
Okay, well there's a lot. There's a lot to this. But what I would say is, you know, it is a common, I feel like, a misconception that with conscious parenting, it's just whatever the child feels, whatever the, you know, it's very just in the moment, and that just isn't the case. So if I had to kind of speak to some basic differences or how an enlightened boundary is different than a rule, right? I would say it tends to be basic needs around a child. So the child is considered, and it is thoughtfully, you get to an enlightened boundary very thoughtfully as a need arises. So that's one thing, and that's in contrast to like blanket rules that just a parent, you know, does because it's convenient, or so there's a difference between kind of unconscious rules and conscious. So that's the first thing. With an enlightened boundary, it's conscious. You're taking each child into account, so it may look different for each child. And then it answers a basic need, sleep or health, and this is going to look very different for young kids than it will for, say, a teenager. The second thing I'd say...
So you're saying rules aren't arbitrary, they're rooted in
grounded
core family values.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I'd say is children, particularly as they get older, so let's say middle childhood to teens, are part of the conversation around enlightened boundaries. So they can speak their mind about it, they can share their feelings about it, and from there you can connect around it. That doesn't mean that you're going to change the boundary. That means that the process of having a boundary feels different. They're part of it. They're part of the conversation. They feel heard and validated in the process. So that's the next part, is that they play a part and there's a process difference to it. The third, I would say, is how it's held. So a rule, you know, the way you kind of think about a rule is you broke the rule, sorry for you, punishment. The way an enlightened boundary is held is as important as the boundary itself. And so what you ideally would not see is a lot of emotion around the boundary, not a lot of personalization and personal disrupt on behalf of the parent. It is a reminder an actual reminder that there is a boundary here, and that the expectation is and that you hold it, and you hold it in an energy that it's interesting. So I'm going to ask you to consider something. Have you ever said no to your child about something, or communicated a boundary but not really meant it, and you get this pushback from them? It's like they can tell you're ambivalent. They can tell you're not fully invested. And so holding the boundary, you're 100% in energy invested. It's like, we've got this boundary. Yeah, but we, at this point, we actually have to have you get ready. Or, and I'll give you an example. Should I give an example of an enlightened boundary, or how
Sure.
it's held? So let's just say a child is chronically late for school. Okay. So the child is old enough to get ready, old enough to kind of take accountability for getting ready for school, and is constantly late and misses the bus, right? So you are constantly having to drive this child to school. So, a punishment would be like arbitrary. Give me your phone. It's not tied to the behavior at all, right? Punishment is it's like in the moment, knee jerk. What can I do to hurt you, make this expensive for you so that you never do this thing again? Because it's very inconvenient to me, right? But in kind of contrast, an enlightened boundary would be tied to the behavior. You really, really are thoughtful. It's rarely you give the consequence or the enlightened in the moment. You usually are going to kind of think it through. You talk to the child about the problem, right? Here's what's happening. Here's why it's not working out. Mom and dad have work. We're getting late. We're late for work because we're driving you to school. So the next time that you are late, now that it's a problem, the next time you're late, we're going to ask you, I'm just going to say, if we had this problem in our family, which we're close enough for that child to walk to school. That child, it's walkable and it's safe enough that I would feel comfortable. So, and they're late, right? So it's this idea that the child takes responsibility for, and oftentimes it's not as satisfying as a parent, because a lot of those other aspects of being a parent come out. It's like, well, then their grade, they're going to have not a very good grade, because then they're going to be tardy and maybe I should excuse. But it's actually getting out of the way of all of that and allowing for the inconvenience of a walk to school. And so this is why it has to be, your response is thoughtful, it's conscious. If your child doesn't care or would really enjoy a walk to school, it may not work. You may have to come up with, something that's a little bit different, but that's the idea, is how it's held, how you create one. The process of it is you try to actually have the child be involved. The child feels validated. And sometimes the child actually very much will affect the process of things, or change a boundary, or alter a boundary, I would say.
Nice.
So that's just an overview of the difference between enlightened boundaries and punishments or rules. Hopefully that's helpful.
Love it. Natasha, you mentioned the beauty of being willing to say, I don't know, and the importance of modeling the ability to deal with ambiguity as kids. Now, this is something that can make people feel really nervous, especially when we come from a tradition that's got all the answers. Why do you feel like the ability to say, I don't know, and modeling ambiguity and uncertainty can be a healthy thing?
Well, this goes back to kind of the balance between offering structure in your home and offering flexibility in your home. It shouldn't be all or nothing. It's just more about, can we role model things that they're going to come across in life? And I think a lot of times Mormonism has definitely role modeled, and other aspects of parenting have role modeled that we're always supposed to have an answer, that we're always supposed to be available, that we're always supposed to kind of be the safety net. And I think it is good to model, things like, I don't know, or I'll get back to you, or I don't have to know everything as your parent. Because guess what? They're going to be a parent and they're not going to know everything. So you don't want to set up like false expectations, right? Like one of the things that I actually get most nervous about when people come in for marriage therapy is when they tell me things like, I never saw my parents fight. I'm like, you didn't? Like, uh-oh. Not that I want to, want you to have too much experience with that either. Like my parents fought all the time, or there was domestic violence, obviously, or anything like that. But you weren't able to see and have role model to you discussions and conflict and resolution to that conflict. And that leaves you without a lot of skills for your own adult relationship. So in a lot of ways, it's not that we're protecting children from childhood. We're teaching children how to be effective adults. When you think about life projection, our children are going to spend much more time in adulthood than they ever will in childhood. We have 18 years with our kids and they don't even remember consciously 3 or 4 of those years, so that's 14 years out of hopefully an 80 to 90 year time frame where we get our kids in this state of childhood development, right? So modeling what you hope they can do as adults. And a lot of times I hear this pushback like, well, but if you don't have answers, or if you don't have like a super big structure, that it's going to lead to confusion or kids being confused or insecurities. And I think actually the research on helicopter parenting is kind of challenging that, that actually it's good for kids to not have everything figured out, to have kids have slight anxiety. We want them to practice slight anxieties before they face really big anxieties. And having your parents say something like, good question, I don't know, might actually be a good slight anxiety for your child to experience in a fairly safe environment. So that, I think, is positing realistic expectations for the future and also encouraging them to have some level of ambiguity in their current time frame of being a kiddo.
Love that.
But Natasha, what do you do if you do know everything?
Then you go in for an assessment on narcissistic personality disorder. and see how effective that is for you.
I really love that. And for some reason, it brings up a little bit around, I think sometimes as parents, we want to protect our children from experiences of loss or grief. So in my case, when my dad died, I had this thought of trying to grieve away from my kids or where they would never see it, to sort of protect them from, and then I had the realization of they will literally lose me someday and lose and I actually wanted them to have a memory of what that looked like, that they could actually, recall and see, oh, I remember actually when my mom lost her dad and that it was hard for her, and, even recall a bit of what that looked like. And so that reminds me a little bit of what you're saying of, that I don't know, or the messiness sometimes and the unknown things of even being able to say, I don't know where he is. I wish I did. I wish I knew what, and adding just sort of kind of, age dependent, mind you, maybe, that type of response. But, modeling some of those things too, particularly to our, middle to older age children.
It's the same with modeling, I'm sorry, It's the same with modeling things like I was wrong.
Yes.
It's like all of these things, if you take a super authoritative approach, it doesn't allow for you to make mistakes. And we want to role model mistake making and repairing from mistakes, so that our kids know how to do that when they're older.
Yeah, and I think ironically, all that talk about respect and of the authoritarian model, I just, the times that I have, really talked with my children around my own humanness and mistakes I've made, or things that I can connect with that might be hard about them living with me or experiencing me. One of just the best moments is when they really connect to that, and you feel the respect from that for you're owning that. And even I loved on a Mother's Day card, here's my 15-year-old son, and he listed a few things he really loved about me, and one of those things was, on a level, I love how you're willing to see your own mistakes and to work on them and grow. I mean, that's pretty awesome. And not saying that I'm awesome. I'm saying I feel like our kids really value realness. They sense, and that's actually ironically where respect comes, is when they sense you're being real with them, you're being honest about yourself, and you're being willing to admit that you're growing too.
Yeah, when you think about all the ways that we get ticked off at the church for not being forthcoming, right? Or not being honest, or not being able to admit when it makes mistakes.
Yes.
We lose respect, when we don't see people being able to take responsibility, to own their own weaknesses. You see this shift a little bit in some of the politicians, right? Like it used to be that 30 years ago, politicians would just, again, never show a weakness, and now they realize like that's even more of it. If I've made a mistake and I don't own it and apologize or take some type of ownership, people are then it's a real deal killer,
That's right. Yeah.
So we're shifting in the cultural ideas of this, whereas before saying I was wrong was considered a weakness or you might lose respect. We're actually finding the more you can be real and honest and show that you're self-aware as to what you should take responsibility for, the more respect you get. And that's the culture your kids are in. I always call kids, the hypocrisy police. They are very good at picking up on when you're not, when you're kind of full of it.
That's right.
As we kind of wrap up this session and this multi-hour, at least 4, maybe 5-hour session marathon on parenting, the last point that I wanted to bring up that really does come from Shefali Saybury, but it also ties back into kind of how we began when we talked about how sometimes people internalize the Christianity model as being a model of brokenness. Or even addressing this idea that a parent's job is to fill a kid, and what we end up doing is projecting all of our insecurities and anxieties and over-securities or accomplishments onto them. And I think we all have a sense as parents for how kids just don't want to be the soccer star if we were the soccer star. They don't want to be the ballerina if mom was the ballerina. That there's just something natural about a reaction in the opposite direction of any way of parents wanting to push a kid. It kind of ties back to the question of what is our role as a parent? And Shefali Saybury makes the argument that our job as a parent is to provide, our kids with the structure and the support and the environment of safety for them to become exactly who they're supposed to be. They're not supposed to become mini-me's. They're not supposed to become the fulfillment of our desires. They're not supposed to become the fulfillment, the antidote to our insecurities, to all the things, I didn't get my eagle, so you need to get your eagle. I had awful parents, so I'm going to helicopter you and be overprotective, over-enmeshed parents. Our job as parents is to create cultivate an environment. You're smiling at me.
Oh, no, I'm loving it.
Is to cultivate an environment where our kids can become who they're meant to be inside. Now, is that too new agey and frilly? Or is that Margi's beaming? So why are you beaming?
I love that.
Is that true?
I feel like I don't like belief or saying things are true anymore. What I would say is that really resonates with me. And that's definitely something that I'm choosing to focus on with our kids, knowing that we're human and everything is kind of fallible. But to me, it's the best strategy I know now. It's worth my time and effort and consideration.
Natasha, what do you think? Do you think that's an okay guiding philosophy?
I love the philosophy, and I think I've shared in the past where for me, when I really started thinking about even the Mormon invitation of becoming a peer with God, and realizing that here in evangelical Kansas, part of why a lot of people didn't think we were Christian, one of the reasons, there's many reasons, but one of the reasons is because we see ourselves as potential peers with God and becoming like God, so that we're not in this continual authoritarian relationship with God. So this was the first time I started thinking about this years ago, when I was much more of a believer. And I really found some beauty in that conception that if I'm going to have a relationship with like the perfect parent, that Mormonism would offer this peer invitation instead of this ongoing, stay in your place type of thing. And so my thoughts about parenting kind of evolved from actually this Mormon space into, philosophers and educators and psychologists that also see that as a very viable way of parenting, and that it has a lot of fruits. Because again, I'm trying to remember that, yes, part of my job, especially when they're little, is keeping them safe, offering guiding principles, being somewhat of a boundary setter and a limit setter. But eventually I want to spend, 30 to 40 years with this kiddo in a peer relationship where maybe I will still be a mentor in some way, shape, or form. And yet I want to learn from them. They have lots to teach me. I want to feel like we can have, rich dialogue where I can model a lot of ability to self-soothe, so that I can really take in this other person that I've helped create, and yet that really is their own entity. So I think there's a lot of beauty in all of those ideas.
Love that.
All right. Well, this brings to close our marathon on parenting. I'm so grateful, Natasha, for your wisdom, Margi, your wisdom. Thankful to all our listeners who have tuned in. I do want to ask our listeners really quickly for a favor. We're just trying to figure out how to share whatever we have to offer on the Gift of Mormon Faith Crisis. As I'm thinking about 5 hours on parenting, I'm thinking, is this too much? Is this too heavy? Is this useful? Is this too vague? Is it too general? Is it too specific? Should we break these up into smaller chunks? Are we even picking the right topics? Do you guys care about this kind of stuff? Why are you laughing?
There's a lot of anxiety around what we're doing.
I just want to make sure what we're doing is useful. So we would love feedback from those of you who are regular listeners who are joining us for the first time. Please email us at mormonfaithcrisis@gmail.com. Please give us your feedback and let us know if you like this. If you don't, if you would like us to do other things, if there are topics you want us to cover, if there are other formats you would enjoy. We just want to know that what we're doing is helpful, or if we should just go away. If you think that we should just end this podcast, stop it completely and go away, we want to know that, don't we? Do you want to wait? Do you want to spend your time doing this if it's not useful?
I do not.
Do you, Mark? Do you, Natasha?
No. Well, and one of the things too that is always a little bit, I guess, of a touchy subject is that at some level we only know if this is valuable if there's some type of financial, kind of, I want to say reward, I think, because I'm thinking of rewards and punishments. We're talking about
compensation,
kids.
Maybe
the compensation, right? And so we could, take more of an approach of offering webinars for, a cost or things of that nature. We've always kind of, throughout our relationship, at least, we've always kind of geared more towards sharing the content we have, and then, hopefully get donations. And at the same time, valuable products and resources have, the value can be measured in some ways, shapes, or forms by money. Not that it's all about that either, obviously, but it is some of it, and we have to be reimbursed for our time doing these things. So if you find value in this, that's one way that you can support us, is by offering a donation or giving us other ideas of products you'd be willing to purchase, or ways that we could conceptualize our information in ways that you would be willing to, be a consumer of. So I think that's just an important part of this discussion, to make it viable, to make it sustainable for us to provide these kinds of services.
So if your heart tugs at your strings, your finger strings, your keyboard strings, please consider going to mormonfaithcrisis.com and making a monthly donation, signing up for 10, 15, 20, 50, $100 a month, whatever you can afford. That will go directly towards keeping this podcast alive. And again, not just for yourself, but for others in the future who are in the panic of a faith crisis. Many of you have kind of worked through a lot of the hard stuff, but there's people over the next 5, 10, 20 years who are going to really be in the thick of it and will really want and need support. And if you can support this and help us put together a really solid library of content, it can be something that people all over the world benefit from, as we know more and more people are leaving Orthodox Mormonism and need support in that process. So please support us if you can. And there are other ways to support us as well, whether it's liking us on Facebook, whether it's giving us positive reviews on Facebook or on iTunes, sharing this with other people, commenting, reaching out to us for coaching services. There are lots of ways you can support what we're doing, so please support us. Right?
Well said.
All right. Well, that concludes today, and we want to thank everyone again for joining us. And we have lots of cool topics ahead on the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis. So please stay tuned, and we look forward to bringing you guys more cool episodes in the weeks, months, and years ahead.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Margi.
Take care, everybody. Have a good one.
Natasha, you're awesome.
You're awesome too, guys.
All right. Talk soon.